In the early 1930s, the land that stretched across the middle of America, places like Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, looked nothing like it does today. Back then, people had turned what was once dry grassland into endless fields of wheat. They plowed deep into the earth, pulled up the tough native grasses that had held the soil together for centuries, and planted crops as far as the eye could see. For a few good years, rain fell just enough and the wheat grew tall and golden. Farmers made money. Families built homes. Hope bloomed like spring flowers, but the land had a memory. And nature had rules that humans had forgotten. Then the rain stopped. At first, no one worried too much. Dry spells happened, but month after month passed with no rain at all. The sun beat down harder. The wind, once a gentle breeze, began to howl across the open fields. Without the thick roots of prairie grass to hold it down, the topsoil, loose, dry, and dusty, started to lift into the air. It began slowly, a thin haze on the horizon, a gritty film on windowsills. But soon the dust came in waves so thick they blocked out the sun at noon. These were not ordinary storms. They were black blizzards. Walls of dirt taller than buildings rolling across the plains like a slow, suffocating tide. Animals sensed the danger before people did. Birds that once filled the sky with song packed up and flew south or east, vanishing overnight. Their nests sat empty in fence posts and cottonwood trees. Prairie dogs, usually chattering and popping up from their burrows, grew quiet. Many dug deeper or simply disappeared. Rabbits, coyotes, deer, even insects like grasshoppers and crickets either died or moved on, searching for greener ground. The land grew eerily silent. No rustle in the grass, no chirping at dusk. Just wind and dust, but not everyone left. Among the emptying farms and shuttered barns, some families stayed. One of them was the Miller family, who lived on a small homestead near Boise City, Oklahoma. John Miller had come west with his wife, Clara, and their 3 children during the good years, dreaming of a better life. They built their house with their own hands, dug a well, planted a garden, and raised chickens. They believed in hard work and in the promise of the land. Now that land was turning against them. Every morning, Clara woke before sunrise to sweep the porch. Not leaves or twigs, but fine gray dust that had drifted in overnight like snow. She tied a damp cloth over her face before stepping outside. The air tasted like dirt. It coated her tongue, her teeth, the inside of her nose. Her youngest daughter, Elsie, age 9, wore goggles to school because the dust stung her eyes. On bad days, school was canceled. The teacher couldn't see the blackboard and the children coughed too much to learn. Inside the house, life became a constant battle against the dust. Windows were sealed with wet rags and strips of burlap. Meals were cooked with pots covered tight so grit wouldn't fall in. At night, the family slept with wet sheets hung over their beds to catch falling particles. Still, dust found its way everywhere, in their hair, in their beds, in their food. Clara would find it in the sugar bowl, in the milk, even in the baby's crib. John tried to keep farming. He walked the fields each day, boots sinking into the powdery earth, but there was nothing to harvest. The wheat had withered weeks ago. The garden had turned to dust. Even the hardiest weeds refused to grow. He'd come back to the house with his shoulders slumped, his face streaked with grime, and sit at the table without speaking. Clara would place a bowl of thin soup in front of him, made from a few potatoes and water, and squeeze his hand. They didn't need words. They both knew this was not just a dry spell. This was something worse. Neighbors began to leave. First the Johnsons, then the Garcias. They packed their wagons with what little they owned, a mattress, a stove, a few clothes, and drove east toward Arkansas or north toward Kansas City, chasing rumors of work. Some left notes tacked to their doors, gone to California, God willing. Others just vanished in the night, their houses standing empty, doors swinging in the wind. People talked in hushed tones about Black Sunday, the worst storm yet. It came in April 1935. The sky turned green in the afternoon, then black by 3 o'clock. The wind roared like a train. Dust poured through every crack, filling rooms in minutes. Cows were found dead the next day, their stomachs full of dirt. Chickens suffocated in their coops. That night, John nailed boards over the windows. Clara held Elsie and her baby brother close, whispering, "It'll pass. It'll pass," though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Yet even as the world emptied around them, the Millers stayed. Why? Not because they were foolish, not because they didn't fear, but because this land was theirs. They had buried their first child here, a baby boy who died of fever before his first birthday. His small grave sat under a lone cottonwood tree at the edge of the property. Leaving would mean leaving him behind. And more than that, leaving would feel like giving up. Not just on the farm, but on everything they'd worked for, everything they'd hoped for. Also, where would they go? California was full of stories, but also full of other desperate families. Trains were packed. Roads were clogged. And who would hire a dust-choked farmer with no money and no tools? So they stayed. And they fought. Each morning, John rose before dawn and walked the fence lines, checking for breaks the wind might have torn open. Clara boiled water twice to make it safe to drink. Elsie helped her mother sew masks from old sheets. The older boy, Thomas, just 12, took care of the few chickens that were still alive, feeding them ground corn mixed with water so they wouldn't choke. They weren't heroes in the way stories tell. They didn't wear capes or carry swords. Their courage was quiet. It was in the way Clara stirred the soup even when her arms ached. It was in the way John kept planting seeds, even when he knew they wouldn't grow, just to keep his hands busy and his hope alive. It was in Elsie's careful handwriting as she wrote in her school notebook, "Today the wind blew hard, but Mama says tomorrow might be better." Outside, the world was emptying. Birds gone. Animals gone. Neighbors gone. The earth itself seemed to be fleeing, lifting into the sky, leaving nothing behind but rock and bone. But inside that small, dust-caked house, life held on. They swept. They patched. They prayed. They shared what little they had with the few families who also stayed. On Sundays, when the wind calmed for a few hours, they walked to the one-room church that still held service. There, with dust on their shoes and worry in their eyes, they sang hymns about faith and endurance. The preacher didn't talk about riches or easy days. He talked about patience, about holding on, about how even the smallest seed could grow, if given time and care. The Millers didn't know if they'd survive the year. They didn't know if rain would ever return, but they knew this: as long as they were breathing, they would stand on their land. They would face the wind. They would fight the dust, not with anger, but with stubborn love. Because when every other living thing had fled, when birds, beasts, and even the soil itself had abandoned the plains, humanity remained. Not because they were stronger than nature, but because they believed deep down that home was worth fighting for. And so, in the heart of the Dust Bowl, with black clouds swirling overhead and silence all around, the Miller family and thousands like them stood their ground. They did not run. They did not surrender. They simply stayed and battled. As the dust storms grew worse, the land fell into a deep silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. The kind of quiet that made your ears ring. Before the drought, the plains had been full of sound. Crickets at night, meadowlarks singing at dawn, rabbits thumping in the brush, coyotes howling under the moon. Now nothing. No birds flew overhead. No insects buzzed in the dry grass. Even the wind seemed to carry no life, just dust and more dust. Animals that could leave did. Those that couldn't died. Prairie dogs, once so common they were a nuisance, vanished from their mounds. Jackrabbits, usually seen darting across roads at dusk, were found stiff and still in ditches, their lungs filled with fine silt. Cattle grew so thin their ribs showed through their hides. Some wandered off, lost in the haze, never to be seen again. Farmers who once counted their herds with pride now counted the dead, but the Millers stayed. John Miller walked the fence line every morning, not because there was anything to protect, but because walking gave him something to do. His boots kicked up little clouds with every step. The land looked like the surface of the moon, gray, cracked, lifeless. He'd stop sometimes and stare at the horizon, hoping to see green, but there was none. Just more dust rolling like smoke. Inside the house, Clara tried to keep things normal. She swept the floor 3 times a day. She washed the same dishes over and over, even though they got dirty again before they dried. She made bread with what little flour they had left, stretching it with cornmeal and water. The children didn't complain. They'd learned not to ask for seconds. Elsie, the youngest, kept a small notebook. She wrote in it every night by candlelight. April 12th, no school again. Sky black at noon. Mama coughed all night. April 18th, saw a crow today. Just one. Flew south fast. She didn't write about being scared. She wrote about what she saw. It helped her feel like she was still part of the world, even if the world felt like it was ending. One evening, A knock came at the door. It was Mrs. Langley from 2 miles east. Her face was wrapped in a scarf, her eyes red from dust. She held a jar of canned peaches, her last one. "I thought you might need this more than me," she said, her voice hoarse. Clara hugged her tight, careful not to let dust fall into the jar. "Thank you," she whispered. "We'll share it with the children." Mrs. Langley nodded. "My boy says we should leave. Go to California like the others." "And what do you say?" Clara asked. "I say, I planted my husband under that oak tree. I can't leave him to the dust." They stood there a moment, 2 women in a dying world understanding each other without more words. That night, John came in from the fields with news. "Mr. Dawson's place is empty," he said. "Wagon tracks head east." Clara stirred the pot of thin stew. "We're not the only ones left, though." "No," John said. "But fewer every week." Still, something was changing, not in the weather, but in the people who stayed. One Sunday, after church let out early because the wind picked up, a group of men gathered near the old schoolhouse. They weren't talking about leaving. They were talking about planting. "I heard from a man in Amarillo," said Tom Reeves, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "He says if we plant the old grass, the kind that grew before the plows came, it might hold the soil." "Buffalo grass?" asked John. "Aye, deep roots, holds tight. But where do we get seed?" someone else asked. "There's a government man coming next week," Tom said, "from the Soil Conservation Service. He's bringing seeds and advice." Most folks had stopped trusting the government after the banks took their farms. But this was different. This wasn't about money. This was about saving the land itself. The next week, a dusty truck rolled into town. Out stepped a young man in a clean shirt and boots, holding a satchel full of pamphlets and small paper bags of seed. His name was Henry. He wasn't from the city. He was from Nebraska, and his family had lost their farm too. "I'm not here to take anything," he told the group that gathered in the church basement. "I'm here to help you keep what you've got." He showed them pictures of healthy fields with rows of trees breaking the wind. He explained how the native grasses had held the soil for thousands of years before the plows came. He taught them about contour plowing, planting along the curves of the land so water wouldn't wash soil away when rain finally came. Most of it sounded strange, but desperate people listened to strange ideas. John took a small bag of buffalo grass seed home. That evening, he and Thomas walked to the back 40, the worst patch of land where the topsoil had blown clean away, leaving hardpan rock. "Think it'll grow?" Thomas asked, kicking at the dirt. "I don't know," John said, "but we have to try." They didn't plant in neat rows. They just scattered the seeds by hand, then pressed them into the ground with their boots. It felt foolish, like whispering a wish into a storm, but they did it anyway. Back at the house, Clara started something new too. She called it the dust kitchen. Every Tuesday and Thursday she cooked a big pot of soup, thin but hot, and invited any neighbor who was still around. Sometimes only 2 or 3 came, sometimes none, but she kept the fire going. She said, "Hunger is bad enough. Loneliness is worse." Elsie helped serve the soup. She noticed how the adults didn't talk much about the storms anymore. They talked about seeds, about where to find manure for fertilizer, about fixing broken windmills. Their voices were tired, but there was a new tone in them, something like hope, though no one dared name it. One afternoon, Elsie saw something that made her heart jump. Near the well, where a patch of earth was slightly damp, a tiny green shoot pushed through the gray. She ran inside. "Mama! Papa, come see!" They followed her, squinting in the sun. There it was, a single blade of grass no taller than her finger, trembling in the breeze. "It's not wheat," Thomas said. "No," John said softly. "It's bluestem, the old grass." They didn't cheer. They didn't dance. But they stood there a long time looking at that one green thread in a sea of dust. It was proof that life hadn't left completely. It was hiding, waiting. That night, Elsie wrote in her notebook, "Saw real grass today. Green, like before." The silence of the wild was still there. No birds sang, no rabbits hopped. But now, in the hearts of the people who stayed, a new sound began to grow, the sound of quiet determination. They started sharing more than food. They shared tools. A broken plow was fixed by 3 men working together. A spare water pump was loaned to a neighbor whose well had gone dry. Women traded cloth for masks. Children played simple games indoors using buttons and string because going outside meant breathing dust. The government man, Henry, came back every few weeks. Each time, more people showed up to listen. He brought more seeds. He showed them how to build shelter belts and lines of trees planted to slow the wind. It would take years for the trees to grow tall, but they planted them anyway. Saplings no bigger than broomsticks standing in rows like soldiers. John and Clara planted theirs along the north edge of their property. Elsie tied a red ribbon around the base of one so she could watch it grow. "We'll be old by the time it gives shade," John joked. "Then our grandchildren will sit under it," Clara said. And for the first time in a long while, that didn't sound like a dream. It sounded possible. The storm still came. Black Sunday wasn't the last. Some days the family huddled in the root cellar, listening to the wind scream like a wounded animal. But now when the storm passed, they didn't just sweep and sigh. They walked the fields. They checked the grass seeds. They watered the saplings with precious drops from their well. They were fighting a battle no one else could see. Not with guns or shouts, but with patience, with care, with small acts of faith. While every other species had fled, birds to warmer skies, animals to wetter lands, even the soil itself lifted and vanished, humanity remained. Not because they were stronger, but because they chose to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. And in that choice, in that stubborn, quiet refusal to give up, they began to heal not just the land, but themselves. The silence was still there, but now underneath it something green was stirring. The dust kept coming, month after month, storm after storm. The banks sent letters. The crops stayed dead. Hope felt like a dry well, dug deep but empty. Many families had already packed up and left, chasing rumors of work in California or cities up north. But the Millers stayed. And as the days grew longer and harder, something inside them began to change. Not in a loud way, but in the quiet way roots grow underground. John Miller no longer walked the fields just to pass time. Now he walked with purpose. In his pocket he carried a small notebook, its pages stained with dirt and sweat. He wrote down what worked and what didn't. He marked where the wind hit hardest. He noted which patches of land held moisture a little longer. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a student of the earth. Clara, too, found new strength. She stopped just cooking meals. She started teaching. Every Thursday, women from the few remaining farms gathered in her kitchen. They didn't come for gossip. They came to learn. Clara had read every government pamphlet Henry the Soil Man brought. She showed the others how to stretch flour with ground corn husks, how to boil water twice to kill the dust-borne sickness, how to make soap from ashes and lye. She even taught them how to sew better masks, double-layered with tight ties, so their children could breathe a little easier. Elsie watched all this with wide eyes. She saw her mother not just as Mama, but as someone others looked up to. That made her stand a little taller, but the real change came in the fields. One morning in early spring, John and Thomas went out before sunrise. They carried shovels, hose, and a sack of buffalo grass seed Henry had given them. This time they didn't just scatter the seeds. They dug small trenches along the curves of the land, just like the pamphlet showed. Contour planting, John called it. The idea was simple. If rain ever returned, the water would follow the curves and soak in instead of washing the soil away. It was slow work. Their hands blistered. Their backs ached. Dust got in their eyes no matter how tight they tied their scarves. But they kept going. Day after day, row after row, neighbors noticed. At first, they just watched from their porches. Then one day, Mr. Langley walked over with his own hoe. "Mind if I help?" he asked. John didn't say a word. He just handed him a shovel. Soon, others joined. Men who hadn't spoken in months worked side by side, backs bent, heads down, planting not for harvest but for healing. They didn't talk much. There was no need. The work spoke for them. The women helped too. They collected manure from the few surviving chickens and cows. They mixed it with water to make a weak fertilizer. They carried buckets across the fields, pouring the mixture near the new grass shoots. It wasn't much, but it was something. Elsie and the other children weren't left out. Their job was to watch for signs of life. They walked the planted rows every afternoon, eyes scanning the gray earth for the tiniest hint of green. When they found a sprout, they'd call out and the adults would come to see. It felt like finding treasure. One day Elsie found 3 new shoots in one spot. She ran back to the house, breathless. "Mama! Papa, look!" They came quickly. John knelt in the dust, gently touching the green blades. "That's blue stem," he said softly. "Strong stuff." Clara put a hand on his shoulder. "It's working," he didn't smile, but his eyes shone. That night, over a supper of corn mush and dried beans, John said something he hadn't said in years. "We might make it, not we'll be rich, not the storms will stop, just we might make it." And in that moment, it felt like enough. But the battle wasn't just outside. It was inside their hearts, too. Thomas, now 13, had grown quiet. He missed his friends who'd moved away. He missed school, real school with books and blackboards and other boys to play with. One evening, he snapped, "Why do we stay?" he shouted, throwing his spoon down. "There's nothing here. No crops, no animals, no future." Clara and John looked at each other. They'd been waiting for this. John spoke gently. "We stay because this is our home. And home isn't just a place with green fields and fat cows. Home is where you fight for what matters, but we're losing." Thomas cried. "Maybe," John said. "But losing doesn't mean quitting. It means trying again tomorrow." Clara added, and look, those grass seeds, they're growing. "That's because we didn't quit." Thomas didn't answer, but the next morning he was the first one out in the field, hoe in hand. The real test came in June. A storm rolled in. Not the usual black blizzard, but a hot, dry wind that lasted for days. It sucked the last moisture from the air. The new grass shoots wilted. Even the shelter belt saplings drooped. People feared it was over, that all their work had been for nothing. But John didn't give up. He and Clara took turns walking the rows at night, carrying buckets of water from their well. They poured a little on each plant, just enough to keep it alive. It meant less water for washing, less for cooking, but they did it anyway. Elsie helped. She carried a small tin cup, giving sips to the tiniest sprouts. "You can do it," she'd whisper. "Just hold on." And somehow the grass held on. When the wind finally died down, the fields were still dusty, but the green wasn't gone. It was thin, weak, but alive. That same week, something else happened. A meadowlark landed on the fence post near the miller's house. It didn't sing. It just sat there looking around as if checking to see if it was safe to stay. Elsie froze when she saw it. She didn't move, didn't breathe. After a long moment, the bird flew off, but not far. It landed in the field near the new grass. She ran inside. A bird, a real bird. Clara came out and saw it too. Tears filled her eyes. It wasn't just a bird. It was a sign. Life was starting to return, word spread. People talked about it at the next church meeting. "The meadowlark's back," someone said. And for the first time in years, people smiled. The government man, Henry, came again that month. He walked the fields with John, nodding slowly. "You're doing it right," he said. "The grass is taking hold. If you keep this up, in a few years, the soil will heal." "A few years?" John asked. "Nature doesn't rush," Henry said, "but it remembers." That night, Elsie wrote in her journal, "Today a bird came. And Papa said we might make it." I believe him. The battle wasn't over. Storms still came. Coughs still kept them up at night. Money was still scarce. But something had shifted. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building. They built windbreaks from old fence posts and scraps of wood. They dug small pits to catch rainwater. They saved every seed, every drop, every idea that might help. And they began to share more than just food and tools. They shared stories. At night after chores, families gathered in the least dusty homes and told tales, not just of hardship, but of hope. Of the time before the dust. Of the time that might come after. John told his children about his father, who had walked all the way from Missouri with a mule and a dream. He didn't have much, John said, but he had grit. And that's what we've got too. Clara told them about her grandmother, who raised 6 children alone after her husband died. She used to say, "When the world goes dark, you light your own candle." Now the Millers were lighting candles in the dust. They knew they couldn't stop the wind. They couldn't command the rain. But they could plant grass. They could care for the land. They could stand together. And that was enough. Because while every other species had fled, birds to distant trees, animals to hidden valleys, even the soil itself lifted and vanished, humanity had stayed. Not with weapons, but with hoes. Not with anger, but with love. Their battle wasn't loud. It was in the bend of a back at dawn. In the careful pour of water on a green shoot. In the quiet voice of a child whispering to a blade of grass. "Hold on. and as the summer wore on, the land began to listen. By the summer of 1937, something small but powerful began to happen on the southern plains. Rain, real honest rain, started to fall. Not a flood, not a storm, but soft, steady drops that soaked into the earth instead of washing it away. It came in the night, tapping gently on the roof like a quiet promise. In the morning, the air smelled different, not of dust, but of wet soil and something green. The Millers stood on their porch barefoot, feeling the damp earth between their toes. Elsie tilted her face up and let the rain fall on her skin. She hadn't felt clean in years. "It's really raining," Thomas said, his voice full of wonder. John didn't speak. He just walked out into the field, knelt down and pressed his palm to the ground. The buffalo grass they'd planted months ago was no longer just a few lonely shoots. It had spread. Thin, yes, but alive. And now with the rain it was growing faster. Tiny leaves uncurled. Roots dug deeper. The land was breathing again. Birds came back slowly. First just one or two meadowlarks, then a pair of sparrows building a nest in the cottonwood near the well. One morning Elsie saw a rabbit hop across the yard, thin but moving with purpose. It stopped, sniffed the air, and then disappeared into the tall grass near the shelter belt. Life was returning not in a rush but in whispers. The change wasn't just outside, it was inside the people too. Neighbors who once kept to themselves now stopped by, not just to borrow tools but to talk. They shared news, yes, but also laughter. Real laughter, the kind that hadn't been heard in years. At church on Sundays, the hymns were sung louder. The preacher didn't just speak of suffering anymore. He spoke of renewal, of second chances. John and Clara began to plan, not just for survival but for the future. They saved seeds from the healthiest grass plants. They marked which shelter belt trees were growing strongest. They even talked about planting a small vegetable patch again, just enough for their table. Nothing fancy. "We'll start with carrots and beans," Clara said one evening, spreading a rough map on the kitchen table. "Right here near the house where we can water it easy," John nodded. "And maybe a row of sunflowers. For color." Elsie smiled. Sunflowers. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen one. The government man Henry came less often now. But when he did, his visits felt like celebrations. He brought good news. More families were staying. Some who had left were even thinking of coming back. The Soil Conservation Service was expanding. New programs helped farmers buy better seeds, build stronger windbreaks, and learn how to rotate crops so the land wouldn't get tired. "Y'all are proof it can work," Henry told John one afternoon as they walked the fields together. "What you've done here, it's a model for the whole region." John shook his head. "We didn't do it alone, and it was true. The whole community had changed. Where once people saw only their own struggle, now they saw each other. When Mrs. Langley's windmill broke, 3 men showed up before breakfast to fix it. When the Reeves family ran low on flour, Clara sent over a sack without being asked. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a team. Even the children played differently. Before, their games had been quiet indoors made from scraps. Now they ran outside again, carefully, with scarves still tied over their noses, but they ran. They played tag between the young trees of the shelter belt. They made forts in the tall grass. Elsie taught her little brother how to find 4-leaf clovers in the new growth near the well. There weren't many, but finding one felt like magic. One day, Thomas came home with muddy boots and a wide grin. "Look what I found," he said, holding out his hand. In his palm lay a grasshopper, small, green, and very much alive. Elsie gasped. "They're back!" That night she wrote in her journal, "Heard crickets tonight. Real ones, not in a dream. Outside my window. The sound was faint, but it was there, a soft chirping in the dark. It meant the insects were returning. And where insects went, birds would follow. And where birds went, the land was healing." John started keeping a new kind of record. Not just notes on wind or soil, but on life. June 12th, first butterfly. July 3rd, deer tracks near the north fence. July 18th, meadowlark sang at sunrise. These weren't farming notes. They were signs of hope. Clara began cooking with fresh things again. Not much. Just a few wild onions she found near the creek bed, some dandelion greens, a handful of beans from their new patch. But it tasted like a feast. The children ate slowly, savoring each bite. "We're not rich," Clara told them one night, "but we're full. And we're together. That's worth more." The hardest part of the Dust Bowl hadn't just been the dust, it had been the loneliness, the feeling that the world had forgotten them. But now they remembered they weren't alone. They had each other, and the land, slowly, was remembering them too. One evening, as the sun set in a sky clear for the first time in years, the whole family sat on the porch. No masks, no goggles, just clean air and the sound of wind through green leaves. Elsie leaned against her father. "Do you think it'll stay like this?" John looked out over the field. The grass swayed. A bird called in the distance. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but we know how to care for it now." That's the difference. Before they had taken from the land. Now they gave back. They didn't plow everything under. They left patches wild. They planted trees not for shade today, but for their children's children. They learned to listen to the wind, to the soil, to the silence between storms, and the land listened back. At church the next Sunday, the preacher read a verse from the Bible. "Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy." No one cried, but many nodded. They understood. After the service, people lingered. They talked about planting more shelter belts, about starting a community seed bank, about teaching the next generation how to farm with respect, not greed. The Millers walked home slowly, the dust no longer rising with each step. The road was firm. The air was sweet. That night, Elsie didn't write in her journal about storms or sickness or fear. She wrote, "Today felt like before, but better, because now we know how to keep it." The battle wasn't over. Droughts would come again, winds would howl, but they were ready now. They had learned that fighting didn't always mean shouting or striking. Sometimes it meant kneeling in the dirt and planting a seed. Sometimes it meant sharing your last jar of peaches. Sometimes it meant staying when everyone else ran. And because they stayed, because they stood and battled with patience, with care, with love, the land began to heal. The silence of the wild had ended. Crickets chirped, birds sang, rabbits hopped, grass grew, and in the middle of it all, the Miller family and the families like them stood not as conquerors but as caretakers. Not as owners but as partners with the earth. They had not won a war. They had made peace, and in that peace, green things grew. Years passed. The dust storms never came back with the same fury. Rain fell more often. The grass grew thick and strong. Trees planted as thin sticks now stood tall enough to cast real shade. The land healed not all at once, but slowly, like a wound closing with care. The Millers stayed on their farm. They never became rich, but they lived, and they thrived in the quiet way that matters most. John and Clara grew older. Their hands were rough, their faces lined by sun and wind, but their eyes stayed bright. They watched their children grow up on land that no longer choked them. Thomas went to work on a neighboring farm, then started his own small plot using the lessons his father taught him. Elsie went to school in town, real school, with books and desks and no dust in the inkwells. She loved to read and write and dreamed of becoming a teacher one day. But the biggest change wasn't in the crops or the weather. It was in how people saw the land. Before the Dust Bowl, folks thought the earth was something to be used, plowed, planted, and pushed as hard as it could go. But the storms taught them a hard truth. The land gives only as much as you respect it. After that, farmers didn't just plant wheat year after year. They let fields rest. They rotated crops. They kept the native grasses along the edges. They planted trees not just for wood but for windbreaks. They listened. The government changed too. Laws were made to protect the soil. Experts worked with farmers, not above them. What began as a desperate idea in a church basement, planting old grass to hold the earth, became a national effort. The Dust Bowl didn't just leave scars. It left lessons, and those lessons were passed down. Decades later, Elsie Miller, now Elsie Grant, a grandmother with silver hair and kind eyes, stood in the same field where she once scattered buffalo grass seeds with her father. Beside her were her two grandchildren, Lily and Ben, ages 8 and 6. They wore boots and wide-brimmed hats just like she used to. "Is this where the dust storms happened, Grandma?" Lily asked, kicking at the thick grass. "Yes," Elsie said softly. "Right here." Ben looked around. "But it's so green." "It wasn't always," Elsie said. She knelt down and touched the earth. "When I was your age, the sky turned black in the middle of the day. The wind carried dirt so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Animals left. Birds flew away. Even the bugs disappeared. Did you leave? Ben asked. No, Elsie said, smiling. We stayed. Why? She looked at the cottonwood tree at the edge of the field, the one that shaded her baby brother's grave. Because this was home. And when everything else ran, we stood. She led them to a small patch near the old well. There, still standing, was a row of shelter belt trees. One of them had a faded red ribbon tied around its trunk, so old it was almost white now. That's the one I tied when I was 9, she said. I wanted to see it grow. Lily touched the bark. It's huge. It took time, Elsie said, but we believed it would. She told them stories, not just about the storms, but about the quiet courage of ordinary people. About how neighbors shared soup when there was barely enough for one family. About how her father planted seeds even when he knew they might not grow. About how hope isn't loud. It's in the sweep of a broom, the turn of a shovel, the planting of a single blade of grass. People think heroes wear capes, she said, but real heroes wear work boots and keep going when everything says to quit. Later, they walked to the edge of the property where a small stone marked a baby's grave. Elsie placed a wildflower on it. This is your great-uncle, she said gently. He died before the storms, but he's part of why we stayed. You don't leave your people behind. On the way back to the house, Ben asked, Are dust storms coming back? Elsie paused. She'd heard the news, about dry years in other places, about climate changing, about soil still at risk. But she didn't scare them. The land remembers how to heal, she said, but only if we help it. That's our job now. Yours too. She showed them how to test the soil, how to feel if it was loose or firm, how to spot healthy roots. She taught them the names of the grasses, bluestem, grama, buffalo. These are the keepers, she said. They hold the earth together. That evening, as the sun set in a clear sky, the family sat on the porch, just like John and Clara used to. Fireflies blinked in the dusk. Crickets sang. A night bird called from the trees. Lily pulled out a small notebook, just like Elsie's old one.
Can I write about today?
Of course, Elsie said. Lily wrote carefully. Grandma showed us the old field. It's green now. She said people stayed when the world ran away. I want to be brave like that. Elsie read it over her shoulder and felt tears in her eyes. Not sad tears. Proud ones. The legacy of those who stayed wasn't in big buildings or famous names. It was in the soil under their feet. In the trees that gave shade. In the way a child knew the name of a grass. In the quiet understanding that home is worth fighting for, not with violence but with care. Other families had left during the worst years, and that was okay. Survival looks different for everyone, but those who remained, like the Millers, became something more than farmers. They became stewards, guardians of a promise, that humans and land can live together if we listen. Years later, when historians wrote about the Dust Bowl, they called it the worst man-made ecological disaster in U.S. history. But they also wrote about the recovery, about the Soil Conservation Service, about the shelter belts that still stand today, and about the ordinary people who refused to give up. Elsie never thought of herself as part of history. She was just a girl who stayed, a woman who taught, a grandmother who remembered, but in her quiet way she kept the story alive. One spring morning, when Lily was grown and had children of her own, she brought them to the same field. She showed them the old shelter belt tree with the faded ribbon. She told them about black skies and dust soup and a little girl who planted hope one seed at a time. And so the story went on. Not in books first, but in voices. In hands that plant. In hearts that choose to stay. Because when every other species fled, when birds vanished, animals died, and even the soil lifted into the sky, humanity stood. Not because they were stronger than nature, but because they loved it enough to fight for it. And in that choice, they saved not just the land, but themselves.